Poop show. I mean, a real doo-doo dilemma. Dookie disaster. A real fecal fiasco. That's how this 50 series launch has felt so far. So unsurprisingly, the 5070 Ti sold out very quickly yesterday, and there's something really interesting going on with the pricing this time around. This card is a tale of two price points, and whether or not this constitutes a good value all comes down to MSRP. The card I have here is the Prime base SKU from Asus. Even though this was provided by Nvidia, there is no Founders Edition version of the 5070 Ti, so this all comes down to the board partners. This is an MSRP card, which means this video should have gone live on Wednesday when that embargo lifted. In a very rare situation for Tech Review, when I started recording this video, I really had no idea what the true cost of this card was. It originally announced at $749 MSRP, but there had been pretty credible rumors that due to tariffs that was going to get increased to $899. When I reached out, Nvidia didn't clarify an exact price point, but they did state that this card was MSRP. So I originally wrote and recorded this video as if this card was going to cost $899, and then at 9:30 p.m., less than 12 hours before embargo release, I got official word from Asus that they were actually going to price this card at $749 confirmed. So it seems like Asus, at least for the North American market, decided to eat the tariff on this card, alongside a couple SKUs from both Gigabyte and MSI. And that's positive news, but it means I had to scrap and refilm a large portion of this video because there was a big shift in tone throughout. That $150 makes a huge difference in the value conversation because the 5070 Ti is essentially a 4080, a base, not a super. It actually trades blows in benchmarks. Here's what that looks like in 4K. It's so close that it made it challenging to do graphs because sometimes the 5070 Ti beats the 4080 by a little bit. Mostly it's very similar performance. At 1440p, the 5070 Ti loses more than it wins, being beat by the 4080 an average of 0.6%. So again, it's basically a 4080. Here it is at 4K versus the 5080 Founders Edition. That's a card that if you can find it at retail will cost you $1,000, with most partner cards costing at least a couple hundred more. We see an average increase going to the 5080 of just over 14% on this 12-game spread. At 1440p, we're seeing about a 10% difference. And keep in mind, I reran all these on the newest driver, which did show a slight performance improvement for the 50 series, maybe like 1 to 2 FPS on average on the 40 series, and basically nothing on the 30 series. The tail of the tape shows the 5070 Ti much closer to the 5080 in terms of memory amount, bandwidth, and CUDA cores than the upcoming 5070, and it retains the 2 NVENC encoders, whereas the 5070 base is only going to offer 1. Unless the 5070 comes in under 500, which it probably won't, the 5070 Ti is starting to look like the sweet spot so far of the 50 series release, which, to be fair, is kind of as impressive as being the most jacked guy at a Planet Fitness. So based on the 5080 Founders Edition fetching $1,000 new, you can see that that $150 makes a big difference in the conversation. At $749, this makes sense. At $899 or $999, where we're seeing the bulk of the partner cards, it makes way more sense to get a 5080 Founders new, assuming you're ever lucky enough to get your hands on one of those. And you can forget about trying to score a used 4080 for a deal right now. At least in the States, they're currently selling for as much as $1,600 for a super. This release may cool those prices off if we can depend on steady restocks of this card, and we really don't know how many of those $749 MSRP cards are going to be out there anyway. At Micro Center, this Asus Prime card was one of only 2 models available at this price, and they sold out instantly. Best Buy was a more interesting situation because the $749 cards, even an hour after release, they never went in stock while everything else sold out. They still say coming soon. I can't even show you comparative numbers with the 4070 Ti because I can't even get my hands on one of those without spending between $800 to $1,200 used. If you're curious, here's what the 5070 Ti looks like versus the 3080 at 4K, and you can pause these if you want. Here's 1440p, so we're seeing a 56% uplift at 1440p and 52% at 4K. When you start talking about whether you should just go to a 5080, it all comes down to which model of either of these you can score. The price delta there could be a couple $100 or it could be $0 depending on what your options are. Making that move offers you a maximum of like a 15% uplift before overclocking. That overclock will net you comfortably like another 10%, and it's a piece of cake, and luckily it's just as easy here. After some light testing, my copy is stable everywhere at 425 to the core clock and 2000 to the memory. I could push the core clock all the way to 475 in benchmarks like Speedway, but real world 425 2000 had no issues, and that saw the clock topping out right about 3300. Again, this is no power adjustment and no fan curve adjustment. I'm sure there's more to explore here, but this is a dead simple overclock that runs stable and squeezes out about a 7% performance improvement. And the temps were great too. Even at 3300 on the core clock, we saw just over 65C with the memory junction temp of 68, and we were pulling about 306 watts. So cooling on this Prime card is a non-issue issue. There's a 0 dB mode here too. There's no lights to speak of, and it's a relatively small 2.5 slot card, which unlike a lot of the other larger board partner cards makes it a great fit for small form factor. It doesn't have the premium feel or look of the Founders Edition, but at least it's not a 1.5 feet long and glowing with RGB. Again, the big factor for gaming with the 50 series is multi-frame gen. 40 series still has access to single frame gen. We don't need to dive into that too much again. I just covered that in a very straightforward way in the 5080 video, which I will link up here in the corner and at the end of this video if you want to check that out. The big takeaway is that it's going to multiply whatever is on your screen, good and bad. And the higher the base rate or your standard native rendering rate is, the better the experience is going to be. For the best results, a base rate of over 100 is great. I personally would not use this if you can't achieve at least 60 FPS because your controls start to feel really sluggish. And again, this does introduce some system latency, so this is primarily for single player games that don't require tight timing. I've been running this in Alan Wake 2 on the 5080 for a pretty significant portion of my playthrough, and I've only noticed a couple distracting artifacts. So few that I can't even repeat them consistently enough to get footage of them for this video. So if you can't achieve a high enough base rate with all the eye candy you want turned on, like ray tracing or path tracing, use DLSS upscaling to pump up those numbers. This renders natively at a lower rate, then uses AI to upscale the image. Where frame gen is very subjective and controversial, I don't think DLSS upscaling is. It's basically free performance, and Nvidia's newer transformer model, even at performance setting, looks as good or better than the quality setting on the older CNN model. So you can use this to seriously improve your base rate with all the detail settings cranked up, and then decide how much, if any, frame gen you want to use to make the experience feel smoother. So if you can score a 5070 Ti at restock, and if you can score one of the ones at 749, those are two very big ifs. This feels like the least upsetting card so far, at least within the confines of the very scuffed 50 series rollout. Let's keep this in perspective. But like I said in the 5080 video, AMD has a chance to pull a really big upset here. We'll just have to wait and see what pricing and performance looks like in a couple weeks. Best advice right now is to not do anything, which is what you're probably going to do anyway, not by choice, just because these seem impossible to get unless you want to feed the scalpers. I had to sneak this one in for Nvidia today, but the very next time you see my face, we're going to be talking about flagship wireless headsets. That's it for today. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, stay up.